Hello, welcome back. It's Laura at Hyperstamper, and I have another recovered journal. So this is a junk journal that I made last year, and I did a makeover for it, completely different cover. I actually made a journal similar to this last year, and I used this vintage fabric, which has the gold threading in it, and it's this beautiful turquoise and Caribbean blue rose and the brown leaves feathers. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it sold within hours of me posting it. So I thought I'm gonna use that fabric again, and so I wrapped it around the entire vintage book, and I added this wonderful bangle that has vintage beads, vintage crystals, and this one is plastic, but it came from a candelabra. And then these vintage beads here. And this is actually, if you take that off, it is a turquoise and silver bracelet that I got at an auction in a big box of old jewelry. And why not? You can use it, or you can just leave it on the bangle. It's a very chunky journal, so you get a lot for your money in this one. Let's take a look inside. This was a separate school library book. And the original book here is from 1957, Under the North Star. And it's filled with all kinds of original antique and vintage ephemera. I don't use any commercial papers or replicas in my journals. There are just a few pages of tea-dyed paper for extra journaling space. So this wonderful 1920s photograph here, looks like that is a train station. And then this 1890s Demarest Family Magazine article here, and that's a vintage stamp on that sweetheart pocket there that I made, and a 1938 Paris, France almanac page, which has it's double-sided, and it has really cool articles. If you throw it into Google Translate, it's during the World War II, so it's got really interesting satire and information in there. And then this is a very pretty postcard, the yellow cottages there, and that is from the 1920s as well. Canadian birch bark here, just some 1937 pages here, 1930s Monopoly money, and that is a lovely vintage, or sorry, this one is from the 1800s, so that is antique paper that you can journal on. Enough blank spaces there that you could journal on it. Another birch bark pocket there. This is from the 1920s, an instructional booklet on how to raise a baby. I bet it's a little different than it is 100 years later. This is a removable floating pocket here, and just put a little vintage bangle on there. And I've got a vintage wildflower page from a British wildflower book, a vintage canasta score sheet there, and that's on a vintage sewing instruction book page. Vintage botanical pages, how to make a flower garden from the early 1900s there, which is really kind of cool. There's the back of the book, baby booklet. And this is a receipt from the White House Baking Company, and that is from 1953. And I also put in here a fixed banknote from the Delaware Lackawanna Grand and Western Railroad Company, and it expires in November 2025. So I wonder how much that is worth now. Probably 4 cents instead of a half a cent. So that is from the 1920s, that one. Very cool. Another 1937 folklore book page here. Another antique book page for journaling on there, turned into an envelope, and a late 1800s guards dial, watch guards dial that they would have used to clock their hours. And here is a really cool vintage, pretty vintage stamp. I just did some hand stamping on there. Here is a hinged, oh, look at how pretty this stamp is. Isn't that beautiful with the Victorian woman on there? Oh, I just think that's so lovely. You can take that off and reuse it, or just leave it in its original place on this 1955 stamp collector's page. And I just made this little booklet out of some vintage tapestry and filled it with some of my scrap antique paper. Just kind of a little fun, funky thing there. And I made the pocket out of a vintage doily. Vintage song sheet. And this is from the 1940s Tony scrapbook, and there's little expressions here on love and watching yourself grow. A vintage hanky here that was never purchased, I acquired it in its original packaging, and that is quite old and quite beautiful. This is always one of my favorite things, which is a page from the 1920 Billboard magazine. And this one is full of, oh, look at these images here. Let me see if I can get this open. Look at these women from the Roaring 20s. It just has the best articles, sort of gives you a real flavor of the times and how entertainment was in the Roaring 20s. I love it so much. And I think you will really enjoy going through that. There we go. And over here is the 1950s bingo card you could journal on if you like. And we have just some vintage lace here. Children's book page from the 30s. And I just made that tag, and I pulled this page out of a 1937 book. You can journal on the back. And, oh, there's a beautiful plate from a 1930s book as well. It is gorgeous. You can journal on the back of that. 1950s receipt. And this is just a handmade craft that is vintage. Back in the day, they would have used the rubber lid seal from a canning jar, and they crochet around it and made those. Sort of like little coasters. More vintage crochet here. A 1920s children's book page here. And then a vintage pattern here, cross-stitch pattern, lovely. Lots of clusters in this book. I really am quite happy with the clusters. Lots of beautiful children's images in here. A vintage seed book page. Another journaling tag I made here, and another plate from a book here. Look at that lovely page. Isn't that lovely? Put some antique paper on the back so you can journal on it. And this is from the 1964 London Times. Illustrated. A very old plate from the early 1900s here. And that's just the rest of that great illustrated news. And another wonderful children's book page here on that nice hard, fuzzy kind of cardstock that they used back in the day. And that brings us to the end. So that's going on Etsy now, hyperstamper.etsy.com. And I hope you will subscribe. Talk to you soon.